They look human. They think human. And according to dozens of researchers and military insiders, they secretly live among us. In 1973, a young Nevada college student welcomed a new roommate into her home. A quiet, pale girl who wore dark sunglasses indoors and struggled with basic appliances as though she had never seen them before. Her name was Raechel, and according to the government operative who arranged her placement, she wasn't entirely human. Sounds like science fiction, right? But Raechel is just one of the many reported cases pointing to a decades-long program to engineer a new kind of being, human-alien hybrid. Could it all be true? Are human-alien hybrids quietly walking among us? Or is this just another wild conspiracy? We will find out together in this new episode of Secret Origins. Welcome. Before we go any further, let us define exactly what we are talking about. A human-alien hybrid in the context of UFO research and abduction literature refers to an entity that supposedly carries the biological characteristics of both a human being and an extraterrestrial species. The concept is not new. Ancient texts from nearly every major civilization describe unions between gods and mortals that produced offspring of extraordinary power and intelligence. The Nephilim of the Hebrew Bible, the demigods of ancient Greece, the divine bloodlines of the Mesopotamian kings. Could these not be early records of the same phenomenon, filtered through the lens of ancient minds trying to make sense of the inexplicable? In modern times, the conversation shifted. Beginning in the 1960s and accelerating dramatically through the 1980s and 1990s, UFO researchers began noticing a striking pattern in the testimony of abductees. Again and again, people who claimed to have been taken aboard alien craft reported eerily similar experiences.
And here I was in a sort of a glowing or a ghost-like entity drifting around, not really touching the ground, and having no walls of any description around me in a huge space. And all there was sort of, in the far distance, was some ghost-like entities.
Medical procedures, genetic sampling, and most disturbingly, encounters with strange children who seemed to be partly theirs. Researchers like Bud Hopkins and Dr. David Jacobs spent decades cataloging these accounts. Hopkins, a New York artist turned UFO investigator, interviewed hundreds of abductees over his career and documented their testimonies in books like Missing Time and Witnessed. What he found was deeply troubling. The entities, typically described as the gray-skinned, large-eyed beings now embedded in popular culture, seemed to be conducting something that resembled a long-term genetic project. Eggs and sperm were extracted, fetuses were allegedly gestated aboard craft, and children were presented to female abductees during follow-up encounters. Pale, emotionless, oddly proportioned children who stared without blinking and never spoke a word. Dr. David Jacobs went even further. In his 1998 book, The Threat, Jacobs laid out what he believed to be a structured alien agenda, the creation of a hybrid species capable of living on Earth undetected. His conclusion was not comforting. Whatever was happening, he argued, it was not benevolent. Skeptics will tell you that abduction stories are the product of sleep paralysis, false memories, or cultural contamination, and they make valid points. It is entirely possible that people who read about alien abductions before their own supposed experiences are simply borrowing imagery from what they have consumed. But here is the problem with that argument. Many of the most detailed and consistent abduction testimonies predate the widespread cultural image of the grey alien. Betty and Barney Hill, whose famous 1961 case is considered the first widely documented abduction account, described beings that matched the grey profile years before it became a cultural fixture. The Hill case was extensively investigated and subjected to hypnotic regression by psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon, who noted that the couple's accounts were remarkably consistent with each other, even when regressed separately. Then there is the sheer volume of cases. According to a 1991 survey conducted by the Roper organization, roughly 3.7 million Americans may have had experiences consistent with alien abduction. That is an extraordinary number. Even if 99.9% of those accounts could be explained away, the remaining fraction still represents thousands of individual testimonies. And woven through almost all of them is the hybrid thread. Women reported being shown babies that felt familiar to them, babies they somehow knew were connected to them, even though they had never given birth. Men described being told they were part of something larger, a program of cosmic importance. Some abductees reported returning to the same craft multiple times over many years, as though they were participants in an ongoing study. Whitley Strieber, the best-selling author of Communion, described interactions with non-human entities that were deeply personal and emotionally complex. His account, initially dismissed as fiction, found unexpected corroboration in the letters he received from readers. Thousands of people who wrote in to say that they too had experienced something similar, something they had never told anyone. The consistency across cultures, decades, and continents suggests something worth taking seriously. But perhaps no case brings the hybrid question into sharper and more human focus than one that began in a small American home in the 1970s and was lived, not theorized. In 1973, a college student named Marisa Kaubel welcomed a new roommate into her home in Nevada. Her father, a man with ties to a classified government facility, had set the arrangement. The new roommate's name was Raechel. Raechel was quiet, almost unnervingly so. She wore large, wraparound sunglasses indoors at all times. She ate sparingly, if at all. She struggled with everyday appliances, the television, the stove, the telephone, as though she had never encountered them before. She preferred the dark. She sometimes spoke in a way that felt slightly off, like someone who had learned English from a textbook rather than from living it. Marisa, per the account documented in Helen Littrell's book Raechel's Eyes, eventually came to understand the truth about her roommate. Raechel, she was led to believe, was not entirely human. She was a hybrid, the product of a program operating far outside public knowledge, in the shadowy space between government secrecy and extraterrestrial contact. The physical details were striking. Raechel's eyes, the feature she always kept hidden, were described as large, dark, and deeply unsettling to look at directly. Her body temperature ran low. She had an unusual sensitivity to light, and she exhibited a kind of detached serenity that was simultaneously peaceful and profoundly alien. But here is what makes Raechel's story different from a cold case file. She was not a specimen. She was not a weapon. She was something deeply poignant, a being caught between two existences, belonging fully to neither. She experienced loneliness. She reached for connection. According to Marisa, she laughed, she cried, she asked questions about what it meant to be human. The government's involvement in Raechel's placement with Marisa was never fully explained. Her father had reportedly worked at a facility where Raechel had been studied, housed, or otherwise kept. The exact nature of that facility was never publicly disclosed. What was disclosed was the ending of the story. Raechel died in a car accident, or at least that was what Marisa was told. Shortly after, she was visited by men she described as government operatives who collected Raechel's belongings, warned her to stay silent, and disappeared. Raechel's short life, lived at the intersection of the human and the unknown, was quietly erased from the official record. Was Raechel real? Skeptics point to the lack of physical evidence and the second-hand nature of much of the account. But the emotional specificity of the testimony, the small domestic details, the texture of grief that runs through Marissa's account, gives it a weight that is difficult to manufacture. And whether or not Raechel's story is literally true, it captures something essential about the hybrid narrative: the human cost of a program that does not care about individuals. Raechel's story is not the only place where the government's fingerprints appear on the hybrid narrative. Far from it. In 1977, the United States Senate held hearings on Project MKultra, a covert CIA program that had, for decades, conducted unauthorized and deeply unethical experiments on unwitting human subjects. Mind control, drug testing, psychological torture. It had all happened, and the government had denied it until the evidence became impossible to contain. The relevance of MKultra to the hybrid conversation is this: if the United States government was willing to secretly experiment on its own citizens in one domain, why would anyone assume it drew a firm moral line somewhere else? The lesson of MKultra is not that the government did one bad thing. It is that extraordinary covert programs, operating without public oversight, are not merely possible. They are historically documented. Several former military and intelligence insiders have, over the years, made claims that edge close to the hybrid narrative. Some have spoken of breeding programs, others of facilities housing non-human or partially human entities. The details are always vague, always deniable, but the pattern is suggestive. Dr. Stephen Greer, founder of the Disclosure Project, has collected testimony from dozens of former military personnel who describe classified programs dealing with recovered extraterrestrial biological material. Whether that material includes hybrid entities specifically is a question that no government document has yet answered, but the testimony points in that direction. And then there is the question of underground facilities. Dulce Base, a rumored installation beneath the desert of New Mexico, has become a recurring element in hybrid mythology. Alleged whistleblowers, most notably Paul Benowitz and later Phil Schneider, claimed that the facility housed joint human-alien operations, including what Schneider described as a catastrophic conflict between human military personnel and grey entities. Schneider died in 1996 under circumstances that his supporters described as suspicious. None of this is provable in a court of law, but the accumulation of claims, the deaths and disappearances, the official silences and rapid subject changes paint a picture that is at the very least worth serious examination. This is the question that separates the theoretical from the visceral. Set aside the programs, the documents, the testimonies. What would a human-alien hybrid actually be? If we take the abduction literature seriously, the answer is close enough to human to pass. In later stage hybrid accounts, what Jacobs termed the third and fourth generation hybrids, the beings are described as indistinguishable from humans at a casual glance. They have normal proportions, normal skin tone, normal hair. It is only in the details that the differences emerge. A slightly too long stillness, eyes that do not quite emote in the expected way, a body temperature that runs oddly low, an absence of small talk and social reflexes that most humans perform automatically. Sound familiar? It should. Because these are also descriptions that humans sometimes give of other humans, people on the autism spectrum, people with certain neurological conditions, people who are simply introverted or different, which raises an uncomfortable question. How would we know? Some researchers in this space have pointed to the dramatic increase in individuals who exhibit non-neurotypical traits over the past several decades and suggested, carefully, controversially, that some portion of this shift might be connected to something other than better diagnostic tools and social awareness. It is a provocative idea, and one that mainstream science categorically rejects. But it speaks to a deeper anxiety in the hybrid narrative. Not that the hybrids are monsters, but that they are indistinguishable, that they are here, that the program, if it exists, is already complete. Jacobs himself, in interviews conducted before his death, stated flatly that he believed the hybridization program was in its final stages, that hybrids were being integrated into human society, and that the goal was not invasion in any conventional military sense, but something subtler and in some ways more disturbing. A gradual transition of planetary stewardship from one species to another. Now to the question we have been building toward. If the hybrid program is real, if it has been running for decades, if it has progressed to the point where later generation hybrids are functionally indistinguishable from ordinary humans, then the answer to the question in our title is almost certainly yes. They are already here. But let us think carefully about what that actually means. If you subscribe to the Jacobs model, the structured, purposeful program with a definitive agenda, then the hybrids are here as agents of something. Advanced scouts, cultural integrators, a vanguard for something that is coming. That is a frightening interpretation, and one that Jacobs himself embraced, to the concern of many of his peers. But there is another interpretation, one that Raechel's story, in its quiet sadness, quietly suggests. What if the hybrids are not agents? What if they are people? Beings born into a world that did not design itself to accommodate them, carrying a biological inheritance they did not choose, navigating an existence that belongs fully to neither their human nor their non-human side. What if, rather than infiltrators, they are simply lost? The abductee Mary Rodwell, an Australian researcher who has worked extensively with individuals claiming to be hybrid or star children, describes meeting people who feel profoundly alien to human social norms, not because they are malicious, but because they are genuinely, constitutionally different. They struggle with human food. They are overwhelmed by human emotion. They feel a deep pull towards something they cannot name. Rodwell calls these individuals new humans. She believes they are not a threat. She believes they are the next chapter. What is the truth? We do not know. And perhaps the most honest thing we can say is that we do not yet have the tools to find out. The phenomenon exists in a space that mainstream science has not chosen to fully examine, partly because the evidence is genuinely difficult to verify, and partly because the implications, if true, are so staggering that the scientific community has a kind of collective resistance to looking directly at them. Let us be honest about what we know, what we do not know, and what sits in the unsettling territory between the two. What we know, there is a substantial and remarkably consistent body of testimony from abductees across multiple decades, cultures, and countries, describing a program involving genetic material and hybrid offspring. We know that serious researchers, not fringe personalities, but credentialed academics and investigators like Bud Hopkins, Dr. David Jacobs, and Dr. John Mack of Harvard University, dedicated significant portions of their careers to this subject and concluded that something real was happening to the people they interviewed. We know that the United States government has historically conducted secret programs of extraordinary ethical ambiguity. We know that certain individuals connected to classified facilities have made specific, detailed claims about non-human biological material and hybrid programs, and that several of them died in ways that their families and colleagues found suspicious. And we know that at least some accounts, like Raechel's, carry the kind of emotional texture that is hard to fabricate. The small domestic details, the longing, the loss, the grief of a being who never quite belonged anywhere. What we do not know. We do not have a single piece of physical, testable, publicly verified evidence confirming the existence of human-alien hybrids. No DNA sample, no body, no official document. Every concrete claim has either been lost, suppressed, or has failed to survive rigorous scrutiny. In science, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But it does mean we cannot move beyond the realm of the deeply compelling and into the realm of the proven. And what sits between? Everything. The testimonies that are too consistent to dismiss and too unverifiable to confirm. The official silences that feel deliberate rather than neutral. The emotional reality of people who have lived with something that changed them permanently, whether or not the external world chooses to believe them. The hybrid question forces a reckoning with some of the deepest uncertainties in human experience. What makes us human? What we share this planet with, and how much of the official story of our civilization has actually been told to us. In his final years, Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist who won the Pulitzer Prize and then risked his entire reputation by taking abduction accounts seriously, said something that has stayed with many people in this field. He said that the abduction phenomenon, whatever its ultimate origin, seemed to be doing something to people. It was expanding their sense of what was possible. It was breaking open their understanding of the cosmos.
It is provocative, it's important in the sense that it makes us think. There's something occurring which I don't think can be accounted for in simple ways with dreams or fantasy or cultural delusion or something like that, but I don't know what it is.
It was, in its strange and terrifying way, an invitation. But an invitation to what? That, perhaps, is the question we need to start asking. Is the hybrid program real? Is it ongoing? Are they here? It is now science versus personal testimony, denial versus disclosure. And the truth, as always, is somewhere we have not yet been brave enough to look. What do you think?